This is a brief introduction to this section of the course, Epistemology. In this short presentation, we're going to learn what epistemology is, the types of knowledge we're dealing with, the sources of knowledge, the central questions that philosophers are concerned with in epistemology, and we'll lay out what we're going to be doing in this section of the course. What is epistemology? The word epistemology comes from the Greek episteme, which means to know. It's usually contrasted with the Greek word doxa, which means to believe. The idea is that knowing something is significantly different from believing it. How does knowledge differ from belief is the central question of epistemology. So epistemology is the area of philosophy that's concerned with knowledge. What is it? Is it possible? Where does it come from? So literally, the word epistemology means the theory of knowledge. There are different types of knowledge, so if we're going to investigate the nature of knowledge, we need to be clear about what kinds of knowledge there are. So if you think about what you know, you might think, well, I know what my name is. I know where I'm from. I know how to buy plane tickets online. I know the Pythagorean theorem. In class, I usually get students to tell me all the things they know when we write them on the board. It seems pretty certain that I know a lot of things. Now, the philosopher wants to know what that means. What does it mean to say that we know something, and is it true that we know things? If we want to understand what knowledge is, we could start by looking at the things we know and then kind of extract from those what's common. What becomes clear is that there are at least different types of knowledge. So when I say I know that my name is Renee, or I know that the sum of the square of two sides of a triangle is equal to the sum of the square of the hypotenuse, I know that Conway is in South Carolina, or that Tortuga means turtle in Spanish, or that Obama is president. Notice that all of these types of knowledge have something in common. I say, I know that something each time. I know that. I know that. So this type of knowledge is called propositional knowledge. The word that indicates that a proposition is coming. So my name is Renee is a proposition. Remember, a proposition is what is expressed by a declarative sentence. It's a statement, something that has a truth value. So the statement, my name is Renee, depends on who's uttering it, of course, is either true or false. To say Conway is in South Carolina is a proposition. It has a truth value. So when I say I know that Conway is in South Carolina, I'm professing to have what's called propositional knowledge. Each of the things in pink is a proposition. The word that indicates that a proposition is coming. Now in English, we might not always explicitly state that. I can say, I know Conway is in South Carolina. I know Obama is president. That's still propositional knowledge because the claim is that I bear the knowing relation to a proposition. I bear a knowing relation to a statement that has a truth value. So propositional or factual knowledge is what we call the sort of knowing relation one bears to facts or propositions. This sort of mental state, that is, the state of knowing, is called a propositional attitude because in virtue of being in this state, one bears a certain relation to propositions. Other mental states are also propositional attitudes. For example, believing is a propositional attitude. I can believe that today is Tuesday, and so I'm in a certain state, the state of believing, where I bear a relationship to a proposition. The proposition today is Tuesday. So belief is also a propositional attitude. When I say I know that it's 10 o'clock, I am bearing the knowing relation to a proposition. Not all knowledge is propositional knowledge. Consider these following claims of knowledge. I know how to ride a bike. I know how to make a quilt. I know how to get to Columbia. I know how to make coffee. These are not propositional knowledge or statements reporting propositional knowledge. Instead, they're what we call competence knowledge, when we know how to do something. So notice there's no that there. There are no propositions. How to ride a bike is not a proposition. It doesn't have a truth value. I know that to ride a bike? No, doesn't make sense. So when you see a how in there, we're talking about competence knowledge, or what's sometimes called know-how. There's yet a third type of knowledge. I know Dr. DeCenzo. I know Paris. I know happiness. I know pain. Here again, I don't have propositions. Remember, a proposition is a statement that has a truth value. Dr. DeCenzo is not something that can be true or false. Only propositions can be true or false. So the kind of knowledge I have when I bear relation to an entity or a feeling or a place, that's called acquaintance knowledge, to be familiar or acquainted with someone, something, some feeling. So these are acquaintance knowledge or knowledge of. So we have three types of knowledge. Propositional knowledge, or what's called knowledge that, is the type of knowledge we have of propositions. You recognize propositional knowledge by looking for a proposition. The mind is the brain. That is a proposition. It has a truth value. So if I were to say, I know that the mind is the brain, then I am claiming to have propositional knowledge. Competence knowledge, or know-how, is the type of knowledge we have when we have a certain ability, so knowing how to juggle. Acquaintance knowledge, or knowledge of, is when we bear the knowing relation to a thing, or person, or place, or a feeling. I know Dr. DeCenzo. Dr. DeCenzo is not a proposition. Now, there might be kind of mixed types of knowledge, so you might not be able to know Dr. DeCenzo unless you know that Dr. DeCenzo is the president of Coastal, or you may not know how to juggle unless you know that juggling is an activity of throwing things up into the air. So it might be that competence knowledge requires certain propositional knowledge, or acquaintance knowledge does. There could be overlap. What about I know where to buy mayonnaise? That doesn't seem to nicely fit into any of these categories, but saying I know where to buy mayonnaise might just mean I know that they sell mayonnaise at Food Lion. Okay, three types of knowledge. Now, what we're going to be concerned with in this section of the course is propositional knowledge. That is, the type of knowledge we have when we stand in the knowing relation to a proposition. So look at these questions here, or these statements of knowledge. Are these true? I know that the mind is the brain. Now, I don't always do philosophy of mind in my intro classes, but is it true that the mind is the brain? Could someone know that? How about this? I know that God exists. We just did our philosophy of religion section, most likely. I mean, I would like to be able to say, I know that God exists. What would it take for it to be true for someone to know that God exists? God exists as a proposition. It's either true or it's false. What would it take to know that proposition? I know that killing is wrong. Again, that sentence right there asserts some propositional knowledge. Is that possible to have that kind of propositional knowledge? That is that knowledge claim true? I know that knowledge is possible. Well, could you know that? Is that true? So in epistemology, we're primarily concerned with propositional knowledge. We want to know what conditions must be satisfied in order for it to be true that someone has propositional knowledge. So why is that? Why propositional knowledge and not competence knowledge? Remember that philosophy is primarily after the truth, not what people believe to be true, but what actually is true. Now, the only kinds of things that can be true or false are propositions. So a true proposition, let's say, is one that describes the way the world actually is. So we want to know what must be true, what is true. And since propositions are the bearers of truth, we want to have propositional knowledge. So we need to know, before we can have propositional knowledge, what knowledge actually is. And the type of knowledge we're talking about here is propositional. So, Before we answer the question of what knowledge is or attempt to define the concept of knowledge, there's a few other things that you might try to keep in mind. You might think about how you acquire knowledge. How do you come to know things? So how do you know that Obama is president? You're like, I just do. Of course you do. But think about how you came to know that. Maybe you read about it in the newspaper, or you heard him speaking on the radio, or maybe someone told you. How do you know that you had, say, cereal for breakfast? I hope you had breakfast today. How do you, well, you remember. You remember having it. You had breakfast and you were eating some cereal and now you can remember that experience. How do you know that 2 plus 2 is 4? You might say, oh, well, I've known that since kindergarten. But how do you know it? What is the source of that knowledge? How about this? An n-sided figure, n is a variable there, has n interior angles. Is that true or is it false? And how do you know that it's true? Or how about that Sacramento is the capital of California? How do you know? How do you acquire that bit of knowledge, or that you're hungry right now? So we might need to think about our sources of knowledge. So in each of these examples, I appeal to slightly different things, that we might say knowledge comes from perception or sensation. You can see certain facts or experience them yourself. You could have firsthand experiences or memories or testimony. Someone tells you something is the case. That we might appeal to science in our knowledge claims, or just to reason itself, or to intuition. So there are different sources of knowledge, and in a course on epistemology, you might investigate these different sources of knowledge and whether or not they provide us with knowledge or not. We've already actually encountered a distinction that is an epistemological distinction, and the two words here, they're both adjectives, a priori and a posteriori, we had in the last section, and you should be familiar with them. So for example, a priori means on the basis of reason, or based on reason, or prior to sense experience. So it is an adjective, and it's an epistemological adjective. So it's saying how you come to know something. That you come to know it on the basis of reason, then it's a priori knowledge. If you come to know it on the basis of sense experience, then it's a posteriori knowledge. Remember this A in here, or the letter A, or you could say A or A, it doesn't matter, is not an article, not an indefinite article. It's just part of the word. It just has a break in it, kind of like a cappella. Is that 2 words? I think it is. A posteriori, that is an adjective, so you need a noun to go with it, like a posteriori proposition, a posteriori argument, a posteriori justification. A posteriori means based on sense experience, something that you would know to be true or false on the basis of sense experience, seeing, smelling, hearing, tasting, touching. Whereas a priori, you know it simply by grasping the truth. I have to say I went to Wikipedia and it quoted my friend's husband, Galen Strawson, as saying, a priori propositions are propositions you could know that they were true or false without getting off your couch. You can go look it up. All right, so what are the central questions in epistemology? Well, what is knowledge? What conditions must be satisfied in order for it to be true that someone knows a proposition? What conditions, when satisfied, would guarantee that someone knows a proposition? And then how do we acquire knowledge? What are the sources of knowledge? And then, is knowledge even possible? Can we really know things? Maybe we only think we know things and we don't really know them. So these are the central questions in epistemology. In this section of the course, we're going to look at each of these questions plus one more. Are we? No, not all of these. Some of these, but not all of them. But here are our main questions. What is knowledge? We're going to look at the traditional analysis or classical analysis of knowledge and a problem that it faces. We've already seen what a classical analysis is and how to raise counterexamples, and we're going to get an example of that here. Is knowledge possible? So the view that knowledge is not possible is called skepticism, and we're going to see an argument for skepticism and several responses that try to defend the possibility of knowledge. Now usually a topic in epistemology might be the problem of induction and whether or not we can derive knowledge from inductively justified beliefs. I haven't covered that recently, but you never know. Your semester, I might do it. And then finally, what ought we to believe? There is a normative or kind of moral aspect of epistemology, even though ethics is a distinct area of philosophy. But we might say that when we come to believe things, that we really only ought to believe things for which we're justified. And that is to introduce this normative element to epistemology. And we will be looking at an article, Clifford's The Ethics of Belief, which really is a great article. I love that article. Alrighty, I think that's all we have.